Hello, dear listener. I am a student of International Relations, and today let's talk about the book of Charles Tilly, War Making and State Making as Organized Crime. This essay concerns the place of organized means of violence in the growth and change of those peculiar forms of government we call national states, relatively centralized differentiated organizations, the officials of which more or less successfully claim control over the chief concentrated means of violence within a population inhabiting a large contiguous territory. There is an interesting analogy. Protection rackets represent organized crime as its smoothest. War-making and state-making quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy. Charles Tilly said, "War-make states I shall claim, banditry, piracy, ganglet rivalry, policing, and war-making all belong on the same continuum, that I shall claim as well." Let's consider one more important concept. The word protection sounds two contrasting tones. One is comforting, the other ominous. Which image the word protection brings to mind depends mainly on our assessment of the reality and externality of the threat. Someone who produces both the danger and at a price the shield against it is a racketeer. Someone who provides a needed shield but has little control over the danger's appearance qualifies as a legitimate protector, especially if his price is no higher than his competitors. Someone who supplies reliable, low-priced shielding both from local racketeers and from outside marauders makes the best offer of all. Apologists for particular governments and for government in general commonly argue precisely that they offer protection from local and external violence, but consider the definition of a racketeer as someone who creates a threat and then charged for its reduction. Government's provision of protection by this standard often qualifies as racketeering. How do racketeer governments acquire authority? Back to Machiavelli and Hobbes, nevertheless, political observers have recognized that whatever else they do, governments organize and whenever possible monopolize violence. It matters little whether we take violence in a narrow sense, such as damage to persons and objects, or in a broad sense, such as violation of people's desires and interests. By either criterion, governments stand out from other organizations by their tendency to monopolize the concentrated means of violence. The distinction between legitimate and illegitimate force furthermore makes no difference. Moreover, legitimacy according to Stinkum depends little on an abstract principle of the consent of the governed. Legitimacy makes it possible for those in power to cooperate with each other. The tendency to monopolize the means of violence lends impressiveness to the protective claims of governments, whether in a comforting or more sinister sense of the word, so that they become difficult to resist. And recognizing the importance of coercion opens the way to understanding the development and change of forms of government. As the process progressed, the builders of the state developed a steady interest in encouraging capital accumulation, sometimes in the form of direct profits from investments in their own enterprises. Differences in the conditions of tax collections, in the high cost of a particular type of armed forces, in the required intensity of warfare necessary to deter competitors, and so on, have formed the main differences in the forms of European states. It all started with the desire to monopolize the means of violence in a limited area adjacent to the initial base of the ruling groups. At the very beginning of the state-building process, many parties share the right to use violence, the practice of using it regularly to achieve their goals or both at once. The continuum stretches from robbers and pirates to kings and tax collectors, regional authorities and professional soldiers. A fuzzy and flexible line between legitimate and illegal violence arises when reaching the upper branches of government. The differences between those who use violence legitimately and illegally are being clarified very slowly in a process during which the armed forces of the state become a relatively unified and permanent structure. Now I want to tell you an example. The greatest triumph of the Tudors, writes Lawrence Stone, was a highly successful defense of the royal monopoly on violence in both the public and private spheres, an achievement that profoundly changed not only the nature of politics but also the quality of everyday life. There has been a change in English customs that can only be compared to what happened in the 19th century when the growth of the police force finally consolidated the state monopoly and made it effective in the larger cities and the smallest villages. By the end of 18th century, in most of Europe, the monarchs has under their command permanent professional armed forces, capable of competing with their neighbors and far superior to any other organized armed force on their own territory. The state's monopoly on the use of large-scale violence has turned from theory to reality. However, the elimination of local rivals to the central government poses a serious problem. In one form or another, all European governments before the French Revolution relied on indirect governance through local magnates. Magnates cooperated with the government without becoming officials in the exact sense of the word, and some support from government forces and had broad powers within their territory. Junkers, justices of the peace, seigneurs. Nevertheless, the same magnates were potential rivals of the central government and possible allies of the rebellious people. After all, European governments have reduced their dependence on indirect governance through two costly but effective strategies. First one, it is expanding the scope of the bureaucracy to local communities, and the second one, encouraging the creation of subordinates to the government rather than individual patrons. Along the way, however, all the builders of national power pursued a mixed strategy, eliminating, subjugating, dividing, conquering, persuading, or bribing depending on which cases were provided. Bribery manifests itself in tax exemptions, the creation of sinecures, the establishment of legal claims to the national treasury, as well as a number of other mechanisms that made the Ticon's well-being dependent on the preservation of the existing power structure. In the long run, all this amounted to a large-scale pacification and monopolization of the means of coercion. And in retrospect, the pacification, cooptation, or elimination of fractious rivals to the sovereign seems an awesome, noble, prescient enterprise destined to bring peace to people. Yet it followed almost ineluctably from the logic of expanding power. If a power holder was to gain from the provision of protection, his competitors had to yield. As economic historian Frederick Lane put it 25 years ago, governments are in the business of selling protection, whether people want it or not. So in the conclusion, the extension of the Europe-based state-making process to the rest of the world, however, didn't result in the creation of states in the strict European image. Broadly speaking, internal struggles such as the checking of great regional lords and the imposition of taxation on peasant villages produced important organization features of European states. The relative subordination of military power to civilian control, the extensive bureaucracy or fiscal surveillance, the representation of wronged interests via petition and parliament. On the whole, states elsewhere developed differently. That's it, dear listener. Thank you for your attention and succeed in your studies.